There's a story that we tell each other over and over in this Western culture of ours, especially in time of community challenge. We tell it as a cowboy western, or we tell it as a detective story, we tell it as a war story, or we tell it as a superhero comic book movie. No matter the genre, the story goes something like this. Evil has invaded the good people of, name the city, town, or planet, and the people are helpless to rescue themselves. So from outside the community comes a hero with special skills and abilities, usually involving a mastery of violence, who comes into the community from the outside, destroys the evil, and then leaves in the end, riding off into the sunset or swinging on a web into the New York skyline. This story is so pervasive that we have allowed it to take over the way in which we read the Bible, coloring our understanding of Jesus as some kind of John Wayne or Superman-type hero come to save us from the devil through violence, or at least through enduring violence. Of course, that has not much to do with the real gospel story, but is simply retelling that Western story of the hero in another genre, in this one religious. I guess there are some situations in which that Western story of ours works, but right now is not one of them. This source of evil is not from the outside, no matter how much we want to call it a foreign virus. It comes from us, person to person, spread through physical contact and close proximity. And the fact is that right now we don't need a single hero, we need a community. We need everyone to join in. I heard Dr. Sanjay Gupta make the interesting observation that this health crisis reminds us of how much we depend on one another. My health depends on how well you wash your hands. And your health depends on me staying home when I'm sick. That's how this evil will be defeated, through all of us doing small things, making the sacrifices necessary for the public good, for our mutual health. And all of us will depend on the phone calls, the emails, the messages to keep one another connected and sane through the trying, socially isolated times ahead. We don't need Wonder Woman or Ant-Man right now. We need thoughtful neighbors, attentive friends, loving family members, fellow church members to let us know that we are not forgotten, that we are not alone, that we are not abandoned. So there's another model of ministry and messiahship that we need in times like this, not the old Western hero myth, but one much more faithful to Jesus' example and to the way in which the early church operated. I want you to listen to our reading this morning from Acts and listen for that model of ministry that the Apostle Paul embraces.
Good morning. The New Testament reading is from Acts chapter 18, verses 1 through 4, and verses 24 through 28. Paul in Corinth. After this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. There he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had ordered all Jews to leave Rome. Paul went to see them, and because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them, and they worked together. By trade, they were tent makers. Every Sabbath, he would argue in the synagogue and would try to convince Jews and Greeks. Now there came to Ephesus a Jew named Apollos, a native of Alexandria. He was an eloquent man, well versed in the Scriptures. He had been instructed in the way of the Lord, and he spoke with burning enthusiasm and taught accurately the things concerning Jesus, though he knew only the baptism of John. He began to speak boldly in the synagogue, But when Priscilla and Aquila heard him, they took him aside and explained the way of God to him more accurately. And when he wished to cross over to Achaia, the believers encouraged him and wrote to the disciples to welcome him. On his arrival, he greatly helped those who through grace had become believers, for he powerfully refuted the Jews in public, showing by the scriptures that the Messiah is Jesus.
Thank you, Brenda. The model I want to talk about this morning is partnership, a way of joining together in ministry based not on our ability to fight off evil by ourselves, but on our ability to partner with one another to become something stronger, braver, truer together than we could ever be alone. Our westernized view of the Apostle Paul is that he was some kind of lone evangelist, a Bible slinger without a badge, a Dr. Strange of the early church. In fact, it was quite the opposite. He kept calling partners to join him in ministry, partners like this married couple, Priscilla and Aquila, Jews kicked out of Rome who became Christians and fellow ministers. They shared the tent-making trade with Paul, just as they shared a life commitment to Christ and the gospel of Christ's love with others. That was the pattern of ministry in the early church that has been passed down to us, a pattern of partnership. So there wasn't time to brief the class of children attending Sunday school about the little boy who came in late for the Sunday school class. There wasn't time either for the teacher to find out how the little boy had lost his left arm and how he was coping with that loss. Understandably, the teacher was nervous. She was afraid that one or other of the children would comment or embarrass this little boy or worse, tease him. But taking a deep breath, she proceeded with the lesson. No problems there, no problems with the artwork. He was doing quite well with one hand, seemed to fit in well. No problems during snack time. He gulped his juice down without any spills. Relaxed and quite relieved now, the teacher led her class into the center circle for the little ritual they did every day at the close of class. "Let's make our churches now," she said, leading him in the familiar activity. "Here's the church, here's the steeple, open the doors," and suddenly the awful truth of her actions struck her a second too late. The very thing that she had feared had just happened. Something that would make this little boy feel different, inferior. Something done not by a child, but by herself. So she stood there, ashamed and speechless. And as she stood there, a little girl sitting next to the boy reached over, placed her left hand against his right hand, and said, "Let's make a church together." Those are the moments of grace that churches live for, when our hopes and intentions and lesson plans and sermons and programs are all transcended, and the Spirit partners with us, and we partner with one another to make a church together. And those moments come, it seems to me, only when we truly need each other, only when we truly rely on each other, as if each of us only had one hand and needed another's in order to make a church. Like with that little boy and that little girl, sometimes it's so simple making a church, making a connection to one another, but there are other times when it seems so difficult. When what we need just isn't in the sermon, it isn't in the hymns that morning, it isn't in the coffee fellowship. What we need is something deeper, more intimate, more difficult to find. Sometimes what we need in the church, in our community, in our lives, is a priest. That's the subject of our second reading this morning from the book of Hebrews. One of the reasons I thought of it is because there's a strong school of scholarship nowadays who believes that the book of Hebrews was written not by Paul, but by one of his partners. In fact, the name that is given most often is the name Priscilla.
The epistle reading is Hebrews chapter 4, verses 14 through chapter 5, verse 10. Since then, we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God. Let us hold fast to our confession. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weakness, but we have one who in every respect has been tested, as we are, yet without sin. Let us therefore approach the throne of grace with boldness, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. Every high priest chosen from among mortals is put in charge of things pertaining to God on their behalf, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sins. He is able to deal gently with the ignorant and the wayward, since he himself is subject to weakness. And because of this, he must offer sacrifice for his own sins as well as for those of the people. And one does not presume to take this honor, but takes it only when called by God, just as Aaron was. So also Christ did not glorify himself in becoming a high priest, but was appointed by the one who said to him, "You are my son, today I have begotten you." As he says also in another place, "You are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek." In the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to the one who was able to save him from death, and he was heard because of his reverent submission. Although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered, and having been made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation for all who obey him, having been designated by God a high priest according to the order of Melchizedek.
As I was meditating on this deep partnership that we might call priesthood, a name got kicked up into my memory this last week. Somebody I hadn't thought about for many years, Ginny Geyer. I looked through my files and found the eulogy that I had written for Ginny when she died some 20 years ago. Ginny was the piano teacher in the community that I served. And by the piano teacher, you know who I'm talking about, the one who the really serious musicians go to, the one who is strict, who is humorless, and will harbor no excuses. This is the one who, if you don't practice, will fire you as a student. The other piano teachers in the community were just fine, nice people who helped you learn how to play pleasant tunes and familiar hymns, but Ginny was the one who sternly drove you into darker, more difficult territory, the province of the bees, Bach, Beethoven, Brahms, Berlioz, Bartok. Ginny's life was touched by tragedy early on. Her father, a banker, died of tuberculosis when Ginny was 2 years old. So she grew up in poverty. When Ginny was 8, her brother developed encephalitis that would leave him an invalid until he died early in life. At age 16, Ginny herself was stricken with tuberculosis and spent a whole year in bed convalescing. One of the things that strengthened her during those days was her mother telling of her how in 1918, as a young college girl, she had been quarantined at college in Duluth during the great influenza pandemic and not allowed to return home for Christmas that year. Now you know why my brain was kicking up Ginny Geyer. We're all facing some inconveniences right now because of the impending community health crisis, but we need to be remembering those who have been and are now facing much more than inconvenience. They are facing a virus that can take away their jobs, that can break apart their families, that can take away their lives. They and we are facing real hardship that needs to be faced with the kind of courage and faith that Ginny Geyer showed. As I read more about Ginny's eulogy, I found out something amazing I hadn't remembered. Immediately after high school, Ginny headed off to college, first at the University of Minnesota Duluth, then at St. Scholastica's, where she studied music. And it was her music that won her a scholarship to, guess where? Lawrence University. It was long before I had moved to Appleton and knew about Lawrence. So she came to the music conservatory. Ginny was playing pianos one day at a Baldwin dealership, and the owner of the store was so impressed with Ginny's playing that he gave her a Baldwin Parlor grand piano. It was something she and her family would never have been able to afford. When she told him that she went to Lawrence, he had it delivered to her dorm room. I'm sure Ginny Geyer was the only student at Lawrence with her very own grand piano in her room. One last story about Ginny. In the church I served, just 6 years after they had built a brand new building, a brand new facility, our Sunday school and youth ministry had completely outgrown the existing classroom space and needed to add on something that would increase the building capacity by something like 50%. Most of the congregation had just finished fulfilling their 3 to 5 year pledge to the building, so you understand why I had great trepidation the Sunday that we proposed this new building project. After the presentation was done, the first person to stand and comment was Ginny. She hobbled down the aisle, leaning on her cane, making her way to the microphone. She was quite ill by that time and would be dead within a year of that date. But that day she spoke movingly about the obligation of those in the present to support the future of the church. And after she spoke, there wasn't any doubt that the proposal would pass overwhelmingly. In that moment, Ginny Geyer became the priest of our church. Strange thing for a Protestant minister to say? Well, I don't think so. You see, I'm not talking about a cleric. I'm a professional clergy person. I'm a pastor, not a priest. When I say priest, I mean somebody who partners so deeply with us, who shares our experiences so deeply with us, that they can mediate the divine life to us. They can open up a window on God's holy intentions during those times when we just can't imagine that God is present or has any purpose for our lives and for our present circumstances. We need a priest. We need someone who will let us know in our darkest, most difficult hours on the Good Fridays of our lives that we have not been abandoned. That's the kind of priest that the author of Hebrews, whether it was Priscilla or not, was talking about when she describes Jesus as our high priest. In the Old Testament, when they talked about a priest, they talked about a pure and spotless one, somebody who had lived above the fray of everyday life and so could remain holy. But Hebrews describes our high priest, Jesus Christ, in a totally different way. In the reading it says, he can deal gently with the ignorant and wayward, since he himself is beset with weakness. And then later, in the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death, and he was heard for his godly fear. That's the kind of priest we need. One who has faced Good Friday, one who is a wounded healer, a suffering servant, one who has been to the cross, been to hell and back again with a story of hope and healing to tell. That's the kind of priest that Ginny Geyer was with her piano students, with her church, with her pastor. She was able to be that kind of priest because of what she suffered in her own life, because of her willingness to partner with others in finding the soul of music and the music hidden in the soul. The Bible tells us about the priesthood of all believers. As we face the days, weeks, and months ahead, I'd like to suggest that each one of you take your priesthood seriously. You who have been wounded, You who are grieving, you who have known fear and desperation, you who have known healing and hope, you are the priests that our church and our community so desperately need right now and in the months ahead. You are the ones who can testify to the reality of God's presence and promise, even in fearful and uncertain times. This week, the poet Lynn Unger set pen to paper and came up with a poem she calls Pandemic. What if you thought of it as the Jews consider the Sabbath, the most sacred of times? Cease from travel. Cease from buying and selling. Give up, just for now, on trying to make the world different than it is. Sing. Pray. Touch only those to whom you commit your life. Center down. And when your body has become still, reach out with your heart. Know that you are connected in ways that are terrifying and beautiful. You could hardly deny it now. Know that our lives are in one another's hands. Surely that has come clear. Do not reach out your hands, reach out your heart. Reach out your words. Reach out all the tendrils of compassion that move invisibly where we cannot touch. Promise this world your love, for better or for worse, in sickness and in health, so long as we all shall live. Amen.